We have John Stuart Mill, fierce advocate for individual liberty, the ultimate defender of your right to think, speak, and live as you see fit, as long as you're not hurting anyone else.
Yes, he believed that silencing any opinion, even ones that you might find totally wrong-headed,
Yeah.
robs us of a chance to learn and grow as a society.
But how does that actually work in practice? Because you can't just have everyone shouting their opinions and expect some kind of magical consensus to emerge.
Mill had a very compelling analogy for this. He compared the free exchange of ideas to a marketplace. He called it the marketplace of ideas. And just like in a bustling market where vendors are hawking their wares, a healthy society needs a space where ideas can be presented, debated, and ultimately judged on their merit.
Okay, so instead of suppressing dissenting voices, you bring them to the table, let them duke it out, and then you see which ideas can stand up to scrutiny.
Yes. And Mill argued that this marketplace of ideas isn't just about individual freedom. It's essential for the progress of society as a whole. He believed that the best ideas, just like the best products, emerge from competition and rigorous debate.
So it's like survival of the fittest, but for ideas.
And he really believed that a society that values open inquiry and free exchange of ideas is a society that's better equipped to adapt and innovate and ultimately thrive.
And it leads us to a fascinating turning point in Mill's thinking. While he championed this idea of individual liberty, he also recognized that there are times when individual desires might clash with the needs of the many.
So what happens when my freedom bumps up against yours and we both think we're in the right?
So how do we decide? And that's where his later work on utilitarianism comes into play. Because really, at its core, utilitarianism is about trying to figure out the best course of action based on what brings the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people. If you're choosing a restaurant with friends, the utilitarian approach would be to pick the place that makes most of the people happy, even if it means that one person doesn't get their absolute favorite. Then that tension between individual liberty and the needs of society is a big part of Mill's philosophical legacy. But before we get too deep into that, let's introduce another player into this philosophical arena. His name is Friedrich Nietzsche. Think of him as this thinker with a metaphorical sledgehammer. Unlike Mill, who saw reason and open debate as the way that we progress, Nietzsche was very skeptical of that. He was skeptical of what he saw as the herd mentality of modern society. He really believed that true progress, true greatness, could only emerge from individuals who were willing to challenge conventional morality and to forge their own paths, even if it meant standing apart from the crowd.
While Mill is trying to build a better society, Nietzsche's all about unleashing the potential of the extraordinary individual, even if it ruffles a few feathers along the way.
But to really understand Nietzsche, you have to understand his ideas about morality. Because for him, there is no universal truth when it comes to right and wrong. Just interpretations that have been shaped by history, power dynamics.
Morality isn't made up.
In a way, yes. But it's not as simple as saying anything goes. He was very interested in trying to understand how our ideas about good and evil have evolved over time. And he thought that by tracing those origins, by understanding where those ideas came from, we might be able to free ourselves from what he saw as these outdated moral codes. Get ready, because we're about to dive into master morality and slave morality.
These are some of the most provocative and challenging ideas Nietzsche ever put forth. Imagine two ancient societies. One of warriors, the strong, the dominant, and the other of the enslaved, the weak, the oppressed. Each group developed its own moral code.
So like the Spartans versus the Helots.
That's a perfect analogy. Nietzsche believed that the warriors, the masters, developed a morality that valued strength, courage, and a willingness to take risks. They considered themselves superior and saw their actions, even those that might be considered cruel by modern standards, as justified by their position of power.
Wait, so being strong and fearless is somehow inherently moral? It seems a bit brutish.
It does. But Nietzsche wasn't condoning brute force. He was trying to understand how different moral values emerge from different positions of power. He argued that the master morality embraced a sense of self-confidence, a will to power, and a willingness to assert one's dominance.
So it's might makes right.
In a sense, yes. But Nietzsche wasn't saying that might always makes right. He was just pointing out that those who hold power often define what is considered good and bad.
Okay, I'm starting to see the difference here. So what about those slaves? What kind of morality did they create?
Nietzsche believed that the enslaved, the slaves, developed a morality that valued humility, compassion, and self-sacrifice. They were, after all, in a position of weakness and dependence, and they needed to find ways to survive and cope with their oppression.
So they made turn the other cheek and be meek and humble their guiding principles.
Exactly. And it's these values that, according to Nietzsche, became ingrained in what we often call Western morality, the kind of morality that emphasizes empathy, forgiveness, and caring for the less fortunate.
Is he saying that all this talk of compassion and kindness is just a bunch of weakness masquerading as virtue?
It's more nuanced than that. Nietzsche wasn't saying that compassion and empathy are inherently bad. He was just questioning their origin and their purpose. He saw slave morality as a kind of revenge of the weak, a way for those who were downtrodden to find a moral framework that gave them some sense of power and dignity, even if it meant inverting the values of the strong.
Wow, that's a pretty cynical take on things, but it's also pretty insightful, isn't it?
Absolutely. But there's more to Nietzsche's critique of morality than just unpacking the master and slave value systems. His most famous and controversial idea is something he called the death of God. And it's at the core of Nietzsche's philosophy. He believed that the traditional Judeo-Christian morality, with its emphasis on God's commandments and its focus on the afterlife, was losing its grip on Western culture.
So Nietzsche was arguing that people were losing their faith.
Yes, but he was also suggesting that this loss of faith, this death of God, had far-reaching implications for how we understand ourselves and our values. With God gone, Nietzsche believed, we were no longer bound by divine law. We were free to create our own values, but we were also left with the terrifying responsibility of determining what it means to be human in a world without a predetermined moral code.
So we're all adrift at sea, trying to figure out our own ethical compass, but with no map, no lighthouse, and no divine captain to guide us. That's a pretty heavy concept to grapple with.
It is, but it's also liberating in a way. Nietzsche believed that the death of God was a necessary step in human evolution. It forced us to confront the fact that our values are not divinely ordained, but are instead a reflection of our own wills and desires.
So the death of God is a call to action. It's saying, hey, you're responsible for your own morality now, so figure it out. You mentioned earlier that these thinkers were wrestling with a world in the midst of tremendous change. What role did Darwin play in this philosophical showdown? It's not just about Darwin's theory of evolution being a scientific bombshell. It sent shockwaves through philosophy. It forced thinkers like Mill and Nietzsche to confront its implications head-on. How did they each respond to this challenge? Did they try to reconcile their views with evolution, or did they double down on their existing ideas?
Mill, ever the optimist, saw Darwin's theory as compatible with his vision of progress. He believed that just as species evolve through natural selection, societies could evolve morally and intellectually through the free exchange of ideas.
For Mill, free speech wasn't just a political right. It was practically an evolutionary imperative.
Exactly. He believed that by allowing a diversity of viewpoints to flourish, we create the conditions for intellectual and moral progress. Much like a diverse gene pool strengthens a species' chances of survival.
Okay, that makes sense. But where does Nietzsche fit into all of this? He didn't strike me as the kind of guy who'd be on board with the idea of gradual, peaceful progress.
You're right to be skeptical. Nietzsche embraced a more, shall we say, dramatic interpretation of Darwin. He saw evolution not as a harmonious march towards perfection, but as a brutal struggle for dominance, where the strongest, the most adaptable, would inevitably rise to the top.
So while Mill saw evolution as supporting his faith in reason and progress, Nietzsche saw it as confirming his more ruthless view of human nature.
Precisely. And this difference in interpretation highlights a fundamental tension that runs through their philosophies. Mill, rooted in Enlightenment ideals, champions individual liberty as the engine of progress, while Nietzsche questions whether such liberty, in the hands of the average person, might actually hinder the emergence of those exceptional individuals he believes are necessary for true greatness. Do we side with Mill's vision of a society that prioritizes individual liberty and open dialogue, even at the risk of some chaos and disagreement? Or do we lean towards Nietzsche's call for a revaluation of values, a system that empowers the exceptional, even if it means challenging the comforts of equality and conformity?
To our listeners out there, we leave you with this final provocative thought. Imagine a future where the ideals of Mill and Nietzsche aren't seen as opposing forces, but as complementary aspects of a dynamic society. A society that values both individual liberty and the pursuit of excellence, that embraces both reasoned debate and the courage to challenge conventional thinking. What might such a future look like, and what role might you play in shaping it?